Hello, welcome to Sociology of Crime. This is week 1, lecture 1. If you have not already, please go back and look at the lecture where I provide an overview, the course, assessments, guidelines, policies, particularly around things like plagiarism and so on. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So this week we're looking at what is criminology, what is crime, some paradigms for understanding crime, as well as sociological approaches. So this lecture, which is the first of 3 for this week, will look at what is criminology and what is crime. Probably the best known definition of criminology comes from Edwin Sutherland. This is a name you should pay attention to. It'll come up in today's lecture again, but it will come up repeatedly throughout the term. Also, hopefully, it comes up in your other courses throughout CCJ at Griffith. So Sutherland, with his colleague Donald Cressy, who in many ways continued much of Sutherland's work, defined criminology as the body of knowledge regarding crime as a social phenomenon. It includes within its scope processes of making laws, breaking laws, and reacting towards the breaking of laws. What we mean by processes of making laws, this includes things like the sociology of law, the study of how and why societies define certain behaviors or activities as criminal, studies of the effects of these in people's lives, and so on. Breaking laws, then, conversely means the study of why people break these laws. So here we really get into theories of crime causation, and we'll talk about this throughout the term. There are many theories of crime causation that span a variety of disciplines: psychology, sociology, political science, economics, etc. So part of our course then is looking at theories of crime causation through a sociological lens. Finally, reacting towards the breaking of laws. This includes the study of social responses to crime, such as institutions like the police, courts, corrections, etc., but also other peripheral responses such as treatment, rehabilitation. So one of the things that sociologists frequently want to know, or we look at, is how societies respond to the breaking of laws. In Australia, for example, tends to be much like many other Western industrialized countries, where you have relatively minor responses to things like first-time youth offending, maybe a caution, maybe a youth justice conference or something like this. Unlike my own country, where if you break the law, we take you out into a field, hit you over the head with a brick, and off you go. So, what is criminology? You'll often see it referred to in the literature as simply the making, breaking, and reacting towards the breaking of laws. The other part of the definition is equally important, however. The objective of criminology is the development of a body of general and verified principles, other types of knowledge regarding this process of law, crime, and treatment. So the purpose of criminology in this sense is not simply to describe phenomenon, but to explain them. In this sense, criminology is the same as every other scientific or social scientific discipline or endeavor, with a larger goal of creating a body of theoretical knowledge that explains, in our case, it explains social behaviors. So a theory in this sense, Kerlinger notes, a set of interrelated constructs or concepts, definitions and propositions that present a systematic view of phenomenon by specifying relations among variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting phenomenon. We'll come back to why this is important in weeks 2 and 3. In terms of what is criminology, it's easier to define it as a discipline than the question, what is crime, right? And this question, I think, if you were to take this home to your parents tonight, or take it to your friends, or other people that aren't criminology students, the definition of crime seems pretty self-evident. This is why when I fly anywhere, I tell people that I'm an accountant. The last thing I tell people is I'm a criminologist, because everybody already knows what crime is. Right? So inevitably, and this will happen to you as a student, inevitably somebody will tell you why you actually don't know anything about what you study, but they know it all. Right? So if that hasn't happened to you yet. If it has, welcome to the club. Right? So from a criminological perspective, thinking about it through a sociological lens, it's often self-evident to people what crime is, but when we begin to peel back these definitions, they don't work very well in many cases. All right? The definitions of crime are always contextual. Sociologists recognize that with few exceptions, what may be considered a crime in one society or a culture may be within the boundaries of accepted social and legal behavior in another. My home state, California, for example, recently legalized the recreational use of marijuana. A decade ago, it was regularly locking people up, depriving them of their civil rights, depriving them of the ability to get things like federal student loans for a behavior that is now recognized as a lawful behavior. So there are very few aspects of crime once we begin to peel away. Murder, right? Well, murder is regularly justified in cases such as war, self-defense, so on. We'll come back to some of the social constructive aspects of this when we look at labeling theory, symbolic interaction. But by and large, it's enough to point out now, sociologists widely recognize that there's no inherent action that any society defines as crime. It's always socially defined. Meaning how to define what constitutes crime, that's the central concern of criminologists. So the most common definition, it's a definition that certainly was at the forefront of criminology, early sociological definitions of crime, referred to as the formal or legal definition. This is a definition, crime defined by legislative codes that identify certain behaviors as punishable by the state, right? Open your newspaper or go on, Twitter or any social media, this will inevitably be the first and dominant perspective. Oh, that guy broke the law, right? Well, he broke the law, he's a criminal. Okay, well, that's what crime is. Crime is breaking the law. Okay? So, most common definition, turn on Law and Order, turn on, the overwhelming media perspective, the dominant media perspective, is a very simplistic, dualistic, criminal, not criminal, good, bad, etc. Some major problems with this definition, though, right? Primary problem is crime becomes whatever the state says it is, right? So here criminology becomes a strange discipline, much stranger than, our social science cousins, right? Let's see, economists, for example. Economists don't depend on the state defining what the economy is. In fact, economists would laugh at this perspective. Biologists don't depend on the state telling them what species are, right? What mammals look like. But criminologists, in many ways, depend on the state for defining what is or is not criminal. In some cases, many cases, you think, well, okay, but, the state are a bunch of boogeymen. But in many cases, historically, they in fact are, right? Or at least we can think back, a case study that we'll refer to a little bit later in this lecture, World War II, the Third Reich, but we can think of many cases, South Africa, or even in our own history in Australia, stolen generations, where the state defines crimes in ways that significantly harm one population or group of populations and or significantly benefit other populations, right? So this leads to the second problem: states' definitions may fail to capture or address serious harms, right? State definitions may be beholden to specific political or social interests. So this anticipates some of the theoretical frameworks we're going to look at later in the term, particularly critical perspectives that make the argument that law in many ways favors the elite, favors the wealthy, or favors certain groups or privileges certain groups over other ones. This problem of relying on the state to define what is not crime was widely recognized as a fault even a century ago. One of the first people to more systematically confront this is this guy again, Edwin Sutherland, right? Sutherland made the argument that crime that is defined solely by the state very often in his day had the effect of privileging the wealthy or the elite at the expense of the poor, particularly in terms of what we now call today white-collar crime. Right? Sutherland did some of the first research in white-collar crime. What he found was that people that committed great harms at high levels of white-collar crime almost inevitably did not have to face criminal consequences. Rather, there were civil repercussions. I mean, they could be sued and civilly or have to, pay fines. There were virtually no criminal repercussions. And he traced this back to their, not surprisingly, to the high degree of influence, power they have over policymakers, right? So Sutherland made the argument that if we simply depend on the state to define what is or is not criminal, this leads to different classes of people having lesser or greater privilege or access to criminal justice, to law. In this case, the wealthy being able to benefit from the proceeds of white-collar crime in ways that poor people would end up going to prison or have to face criminal justice consequences, even if they ended up stealing, relatively speaking, a much smaller amount of money. So Sutherland says, right, or he makes the argument, we can't think of crime simply as what the state says it is, but rather we can think of it more broadly as actions that go against the common welfare of society, right? Or he says in other places that we should think of crime as analogous to social injury, again, from his research on white-collar crime, also his research on professional crime. This is a definition that seeks, this is a viewpoint that seeks a broader definition of crime, less wedded to state definitions, and more inclusive of actions that cause social injury, whether or not the state defines them as such. So contemporary examples might include green criminology, right? Massive polluting is still legal in many places. Green criminology makes the argument of whether or not it's illegal is secondary to the fact that it, without question, causes significant social harms. Social harms to ecologies and social harms to people. People that live in areas of extremely high pollution, for example, poor areas in the United States, have significantly shorter lifespans. They have significantly increased health problems, respiratory problems, neurological problems, etc. Green criminology makes the argument that the massive amount of pollution that occurs in this way constitutes a fundamental social harm, right? And that the state allows this type of polluting to happen doesn't alleviate or doesn't mitigate the actual social harm that's occurring. Other example might be to look at corporate crimes. Okay? One of the other things that I wanted to point out about Sutherland and why thinking of crime as social harm is important is the misconception that white-collar crime isn't very serious, right? Or that these types of crimes aren't very serious. In fact, the research tells us the opposite. The cumulative effect of white-collar crime financially is far greater than street crime. Right? The FBI in the United States has recognized this for decades, many other states as well. Right? So we can see here, neglect of white-collar crime victims seems particularly unfortunate in light of its enormous physical, economic, and social toll. No one disputes that it produces far more destruction and costs than conventional crime. Victims of white-collar crime suffer death, others suffer serious injuries or exposure to unsafe working conditions that cause long-term, progressively debilitating illnesses. Financial losses may leave others with a lower standard of living, etc., etc., right? So Sutherland was really one of the first to make this important argument that white-collar crime isn't a less serious type of offense. Even when the state refuses to recognize it as an offense, it very often results in loss of money or loss of privilege, loss of quality of life, or in many cases even death. Okay, so two definitions thus far: crime as what the state says it is, formal legal definition, and crime as social harm. Third definition that will pop up throughout the term is this notion of crime as deviance or norm violation. This brings us more squarely into sociological definitions of crime. So this guy here, Emile Durkheim, was one of the first modern sociologists living at the end of the 19th century. He witnessed massive social changes, massive social upheavals, right, from absolutist states to representative or democratic states. The rise of industrialization, the rise of urbanization, war, civil war, etc. So probably at no point in the last 500 years have we seen such a rapid restructuring of society than at the time when Durkheim and some other social theorists that we'll look at lived. Throughout all of this, Durkheim makes an observation about crime. All right, this is the beginning of what we might think of as modern crime control. Beginning in police departments, crime becomes increasingly defined as a social problem. Durkheim makes a particular argument. He says, well, crime might be a problem, but in some ways it's also a functional element of society, meaning society needs a certain amount of crime. He makes the argument that crime functions, for example, to define moral boundaries. We can't know what a saint is without a requisite sinner. Right? Can't know what a criminal is without a requisite, a law abider. So he makes the argument that all societies have a need for a certain amount of crime, right? And there's a balance, and ideally there'll be a functional balance in society. Not enough crime in society can adapt, right? We need the Rosa Parks, in the case of my country, to go to the back of the bus, to risk being seen as deviant, to help society innovate, to create flexibility. But too much crime, he says, begins to deteriorate or disattach important collective social bonds between people. So Durkheim seeks to define crime then as part of the natural deviance inherent to all societies with a focus on social functions. Not surprisingly, as we'll return to later in the third lecture for this week, Durkheim is considered the founder of the functionalist paradigm for this reason. This other guy here, Thorsten Salin, follows somewhat on Durkheim, but he seeks in some ways to, he says, okay, if deviance and crime exist in all societies, we should be able to figure out a way to look at these comparatively. And so Salin and his colleagues, in some ways, attempt to create a means by which to analyze and identify typologies of conduct norms. So terms like folkways and mores, right? This comes out of their research. And they, in some sense, are seeking to make this more empirical, right? To create a study that can be more scientifically verified. Today, Durkheim's work is still exceedingly influential. In fact, since the 100 and some years since his death, his work has ebbed and flowed several times in terms of becoming more important and then fading a little bit, becoming more important. Salin's work, not so much. He's still an important figure. We'll still look at him throughout the term, but we'll come back to Durkheim many times. That's a name that you absolutely should know. Finally, the fourth definition we'll look at before we conclude this first part of week 1 lecture, crime is human rights violation, right? So if Sutherland took one step away from the state's control of definitions, this takes it a whole step further, right? This emerges out of the problems of statelessness, genocide, and gross human rights violations in the 20th century. So this is forged really in the aftermath of World War II, when the United States and other countries and then the fledgling United Nations is faced with the problem of prosecuting, in particular, German war criminals without precedent, legal precedent, for those of you that are double degree students, and in many cases without a requisite crime to be prosecuted. And I'll spare you the full history, but it is important to note that in many ways the Germans were extremely systematic in the way in which they went about genocide and other types of war crimes. For example, stripping Jews of their citizenship, right? This wasn't just intended to humiliate, it was intended to be able to make an argument that because Jews were citizens of no state, that murdering them, in fact, constituted no crime, right? So what are now called the Nuremberg trials following World War II were faced with some particular questions about how do we recognize crimes when, according to the legal code of that state and that place, no crime was committed, right? And we see this over and over. We see this historically in the case of stolen generations in Australia, case of apartheid in South Africa, or this last slide comes from the United States in the war in Iraq. This is the sexual torture and humiliation of Iraqi prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prison, for which virtually no Americans were brought to trial, and certainly not on a whole was the system ever, but widely recognized by legal scholars in this area as definitive war crimes. So, crime is human rights violation then looks at the question, what happens when the state itself is the offender, right? This brings us, in a sense, full circle from the formal legal definition, where criminologists are dependent upon the state for defining what is crime. Well, now we have situations where the state itself acts as an offender, and this prospective crime is human rights violations, seeks to articulate and to analyze a broader level by which we can appeal to not only to ethical but legal aspects of right and wrong when the state itself is not adhering to that. So then this seeks to question the problem and problematize why criminology has focused to such a high degree on individual or group crimes while largely ignoring state crimes. So Morrison notes, and we'll end on this, I think it's worth thinking about. Criminology is a modern academic discipline devoted to the study of crime that has largely ignored the range of mass murders, rapes, and associated atrocities, that destruction of people and their culture, which have been loosely placed under the rubric of the term genocide. In this article, Morrison wants us to think about, why is criminology so focused on street crime? Why are we so focused on, or what Ray Surratt from the Weekly Review of Readings this week calls the icon of the predator criminal, when in fact the mass majority of violence in the 20th century, which has been a phenomenally violent century overall, has been committed at the level of war, the level of state atrocity, at the level of genocide. Why is criminology so focused on individual acts while largely turning a blind eye to the massive amount of violence that happens on a more systemic, institutional, or state level? This is one of his critiques of criminology. While there have been some recent attempts to incorporate the study of genocide, he says, or at least to comment on its absence, criminology as a mainstream discipline operates oblivious to genocide. One of the reasons why in this article Morrison calls criminology an ideology. This is a term we'll pick up on, or this is a concept we'll pick up on later in the term when we go back to Marxist and critical perspectives on criminology. Okay? So this ends this first lecture, and we'll go ahead and start part 2 when we look at different paradigms or etiologies of crime.